Hello, this is Melly. My pronouns are she, her. In this video, I'm going to give a quick demo of Triceratops, which is a plugin for Grasshopper and Rhino. Triceratops is a plugin that lets you construct 3D scenes like this, and then export it in a format that you can then use to load onto your website using the JavaScript library 3.js. If you want to follow along, you can download Triceratops and then in the examples folder open up the Rhino file called example scene, which also has a corresponding Grasshopper file called example scene. And then in the Grasshopper file, zoom into serve your website and toggle this to true. This will automatically load the example scene that you can then use to follow along. And so in this tutorial today, I'm going to explain the different objects in the scene and how to use them. And so to start out, I will talk about the scene itself, which the scene is constructed in this component here called compile scene. And the scene essentially compiles all the different objects that you define in Grasshopper. And you can see here there's quite a few of them. And it compiles it into a single scene or a single object. You'll also see that there are some atmospheric properties to the scene as well. One of these is fog, which comes from this fog component. Another is actually a white background, which is coming from this color swatch here. And then you'll also notice that there is some environmental lighting. And Triceratops allows for several types of environmental lighting. The first of which is ambient light, which is hard to see. It's really light that is emitted from every direction. And so you'll notice here that even these objects, even in shadow, they're not completely black. They're still lit. So that's actually coming from the ambient light, as well as the hemisphere light, which is similar to the ambient light, except for it treats light coming from above as separate from light coming from below. So you can actually color them differently. This one has subtle blue for the light coming from the sky, and then a beige for light coming from the ground. And the last environmental light here is the directional light. And you can see the evidence of the directional light here in these shadows that are cast. And you'll notice that they're always cast on the same side of the object. There's just one directional light for the whole scene. That's both casting these shadows and creating the lighting effects on these objects here. And there are also 3 types of local lights. So you'll see here, this is the spotlight, which is this blue one. And for the purposes of this example file, I put a little blue sphere around the origin of the light. But in reality, you wouldn't see this. It would just, all you would see is the impact of the light, so where the light is being projected. So the spotlight, it allows you to define an origin and then a target for the light, which is somewhere down here. And then it shines the light in a cone shaped towards that target. The point light essentially emits light in every direction, only you can see there's some fall off here. So there's a limit to the distance at which this light will have an impact. And then the rect area light emits light from a rectangular shaped object. And you'll notice here that the rect area light does not create shadows on objects the way the point light does and the spotlight does. Okay, Next, I'm going to show you the different types of geometry and materials that you can export. I'm going to start with meshes. And so this is what the mesh component looks like. And you can export it without a material. What will happen if you do that is the mesh will just appear white in the 3.js scene. So you probably want to use a material. There's several that you can use with Triceratops. The first one is the mesh normal material. What this does is it colors faces of the mesh based on the direction that they're facing relative to the camera. So you see if I rotate around it, the colors change. So this might be useful for troubleshooting geometry, but it's probably not a material that you want to use in your finished scene. Another perhaps more useful material is the mesh basic material, which is this component here. And this will color your meshes with a uniform color. So it is not impacted by lighting. And optionally, you can also turn this into wireframe using the wireframe component. And this will make the faces transparent, but it will make all of the edges of the mesh visible. And this is after triangulation. So you can see the wireframe ends up being all these triangle edges. And then the last and perhaps the most useful material is the mesh standard material, which is this component here. And so the mesh standard material both receives light, but it also casts shadow and receives shadow. So you can see shadow here is being casted both on the ground, but it's also being cast on the adjacent object. And so this is much more useful. And there's a number of properties that the mesh standard material has that make it even more useful. So two of these are roughness and metalness. And this is how you can create materials that are more metallic, for instance. And so if you were to set the roughness to 0 and the metalness to 1, you can make your material more metallic, for instance. And on the mesh standard material component, you can see these are properties, roughness, metalness on that component. Additional properties for the mesh standard material are for emissiveness. And so you can set both emissive intensity and emissive color. And what this does is it makes your material look as though it's actually emitting light. And so in this case, the emissive color is orange. And so it actually looks like the object is emitting orange light. However, you'll notice that it's not actually casting any light on the adjacent objects. It's purely just a material on that object, and it does not impact the scene around it. The last thing that you can do with the mesh standard material is apply textures. And this can be very useful. The texture component, so there's actually two components. There's the texture component, and then there's the mesh standard material maps component. And so in this case, this UV texture, it only has a single map, which is the main map, which allows you to project an image onto the object. But there's all these other maps that you can add. And so if we look over here at the brick texture, we can see that this material looks a bit more dynamic. It's actually using 3JS's physically based rendering And if I scroll down here, you'll see that it's actually using 4 different maps. It's using the basic map for the image. It's also using a bump map, which gives it a slightly more 3D appearance. It's using a normal map, which impacts the way the light hits the object in a way that's more 3D. And then there's also a roughness map, which gives it this slight specular in particular parts of the texture, but not across the whole object. And all of these together allow you to make textures that are more dynamic and look more realistic. And then another type of texture that you can apply to this material you can see here. So this is a chrome material, and it's actually, you can't just create a reflective material in 3.js. You have to literally create the environment. It's called the environment map that is being reflected in the object. And so you'll notice that this object isn't reflecting what's around it. It's reflecting an image, which is actually a texture. And so this texture, again, it's applied through the mesh standard material maps component, but it uses the environment map properties. And you'll see if you follow this back here, I have an environment map set up here, which it's essentially the cube texture component. And each side of the cube is a different image, so there's 6 images that build this texture. And that texture build essentially is an environment for the object and for that material. And lastly, there's a couple other things that you can do with meshes. You can color a mesh based on its vertexes or vertices. And so this is a separate component from the mesh component. This is called mesh vertex colors. And it allows you to feed in a mesh that has its vertices colored based on a grasshopper gradient. And you can augment this even further by also using this mesh color faces component. And what this does is it takes a gradient and it actually constructs the mesh, but it separates each face so that it's a different color. So it doesn't do this smooth interpolation. That's the default of the component. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next geometry type, which are lines. This is the line component. And again, if we don't apply a material to it, it just appears as white in the 3.js scene. And so we actually want to probably apply a material. There's 2 different materials for lines. There's the line basic material, which you can see here, which colors those lines blue. And there's also the line dashed material, which you can see here. And the default 3.js lines, they don't allow you to set thickness. There are some other types of lines in 3.js, but they're not a part of Triceratops, so you're limited to this fixed line weight. And then the last component for lines that's useful is line vertex colors. And so you can see here that you can color the line based on the vertices. So this is similar to the way you do with meshes. You can use the grasshopper gradients, and then you can give this nice interpolated gradient to your lines. Okay, so lastly, I'm going to show point geometry. Again, if you just set points with the geometry component, they'll show up as white in the 3.js scene. And the default appearance for points is that they're actually squares of a fixed size. So if you want to change the size and color, what you have to do is add a material. And so there is one material that Triceratops offers for points called points material, but you can actually do a number of things with this. So if you can change the color and size, as demonstrated here. And you can also change the shape. So you might want your points to be circles. Seems like probably a more desirable shape for the points. And so the way that you can do that is by utilizing the points material, but then adding a texture map to it. And so you can see that this is being added in as an alpha map. And so this texture, it's a black and white image of a circle, and it essentially crops out the outside of the circle. And this allows you to actually make points that are really any shape you want. So this one is showing the same technique, but with plus symbol. And then you can also actually add not just an alpha map, but you can add a texture to the point. So this one is showing the Triceratops logo added as an image, rather than using the alpha map. It uses the standard map here. And then finally, you can also color points in a point cloud in the same way, or in a similar way that you do with lines and meshes, where you can color each vertice separately. And again, this is using gradients from Grasshopper and a separate component called point vertex colors. And so this lets you essentially create one point cloud with various colors. Okay, so that concludes what I'm covering in this demo. This example scene is a great way to get familiar with Triceratops, and it's a great reference file for essentially looking at what is possible with Triceratops. So you can use it as essentially a template for configuring components in the way to create these different effects. Thanks for watching.